So I'm going to continue with Corono False Alarm. I'm going to start on the last paragraph I left off on. Sorry about the last video, it did cut off rather quickly, but here we go. So let us assume that the PCR test is incredibly good and produces 99.5% correct results. That sounds and would indeed be exceptional. It means that one can expect only 0.5% false positives. Now take the cruise ship Mein Schiff. After a crew member had tested positive for the virus, almost 2,900 people from countries were forced into ship quarantine. Many had been on board for 9 months. Complaints reached the outside world about the prison-like conditions, psychological problems abounded, and nerves were frayed. 9 positive cases were reported after testing was completed. 1 person who tested positive had a cough and the other 8 were without symptoms. Might they have belonged to the 0.5% false positive cases, as perhaps the very first case had been? Where were the true positives? That must theoretically have been there. Were they possibly tested as false negative, or were all positive tests false? In the context of false results, we should consider the following: that the epidemic subsided in Germany in mid-April. So the epidemic subsided in Germany in mid-April. PCR testing became a dangerous source of misinformation because numbers of new cases were derived from the background noise of false positive results. When all 750 employees of the Charité Berlin, one of Europe's largest university hospitals, were tested from April the 7th to April the 21st, 0.33% were positive, true or false. When positive test rates drop below a certain limit, it is senseless to continue mass screening for the virus in non-symptomatic individuals and use of numbers acquired under these circumstances as a reason for implementing any measures should not be tolerated. Selective or representative who was tested. There is only one way to approximate how many people are infected during an epidemic with an agent that causes high number of unnoticed infections. At sites of an outbreak, the population must be tested as extensively as possible. But scientists who called for this during the coronavirus epidemic were ignored. Instead, the Robert Koch Institute, the German federal government agency, and Research Institute for Disease Control stipulated at the beginning that only selective testing should be carried out, exactly the opposite of what should have happened. And as the epidemic ran its course, the RKI stepwise altered the testing strategy, always in the diametrically wrong direction. At first, only people who had been at high risk area and or had been in contact with an infected person and also presented with flu-like symptoms were to be tested. At the end of March, the RKI then changed the recommendation test criteria to flu-like symptoms and at the same time contact with an infected person. At the beginning of May, the president of the RKI, Professor Lothar Wieler, announced people with even the slightest symptoms should be tested. The responsibility for translating these dubious decisions into action lay entirely within the hands of the local health authorities. A co-worker at our lab was a typical example. The coach of her football team was coronavirus positive. The players, all from different administrative districts, were sent home on 14-day quarantine. One player developed symptoms with coughing and hoarseness and wanted to get tested but was refused on the grounds that she had no fever. A player from a neighbouring district had no symptoms, but the local health authority ordered a test despite this fact. This resulted in chaos, cause for the appalling ineptness of the authorities from top to bottom. What would have been urgently needed instead were scientifically sound studies to clarify basic issues of the virus dissemination. As many as possible should have been tested in outbreak areas. Antibody responses in those that had tested positive could have subsequently been assessed. Only a single such study addressing these questions was undertaken in Germany. The Heinsberg investigation conducted by Professor Hendrik Streeck, director of the Institute of Virology at the University of Bonn. Aware of the importance of the preliminary data, these were presented at a press conference where Streeck was torn apart by the dishevelling media. The fatality rate was ridiculed as being impossible because it was 10 times lower than that acknowledged experts and the WHO, lower than what acknowledged experts and the WHO had been spreading as established facts. After completion of the study, final results essentially confirming the preliminary report were again presented and again deemed by the media to be flawed and inconclusive, but the results of the study spoke for themselves and they contradicted the panic propaganda of the media. The number of conducted tests directly influences infection statistics. A third factor added to the statistical mess. Imagine that you wanted to count the number of migratory bird species in a large lake district. There are hundreds and thousands, but your counting device can only count 5,000 per day. Next day, you ask a colleague to help, and together you arrive at 10,000 counts. The day after that, 2 more colleagues join in and 20,000 birds are counted. In short, the higher the testing capacity, number of tests, the higher the numbers, as long as innumerable unidentified cases abound, as with SARS-CoV-2. The more tests are performed, the more COVID-19 cases are found during the epidemic. This is the essence of a laboratory-created pandemic. Now recall that the test was neither 100% specifically nor 100% sensitivity, meaning that occasionally you would mistake a log for a bird. Therefore, even after all our birds had long since moved on, you would still find many by just performing a sufficient number of tests. In conclusion, no reliable data exists regarding the true number of infection at any stage of the epidemic in this country. At the peak of the epidemic, the official numbers must have been gross underestimates in the order of 10 or even more. As it waned at the end of April, in Germany the numbers must also have been gross overestimates. Basing any political decision on official numbers at any stage was fallacy. How many deaths did SARS-CoV-2 infection claim? Here again, we have the dilemma of definition. What is a coronavirus death? If I drive to a hospital to be tested and later have a fatal car accident, just as my positive test results are returned, I become a coronavirus death. If I am diagnosed positive for coronavirus and jump off the balcony in shock, I also become a coronavirus death. The same is true for a sudden stroke, etc., as openly declared by the RKI president. Wheeler, every individual with a positive test result at the time of death is entered into the statistics. The first coronavirus death in the northernmost state of Germany, Schleswig-Holstein, occurred in a palliative ward where a patient was terminal esophageal cancer, was seeking peace before embarking on his last journey. A swab was taken just before his demise that was returned positive. After his death, he might equally well have been positive for other viruses such as rhino, adeno, or influenza virus if they had been tested for. This particular case did not need more testing or a post-mortem to determine the actual cause of death. However, with the emergence of the new and possibly dangerous infectious disease, autopsies should be undertaken in case of doubt to clarify the actual cause of death. Only one pathologist ventured to fulfill this task in Germany, against the specific advice of the RKI Professor Klaus Puschel, director of the Institute of Forensic Medicine, Hamburg University, performed autopsies on all coronavirus victims and found that not one had been healthy. Most had suffered from several pre-existing conditions. 1 in 2 suffered from coronary heart disease. Other frequent ailments were hypertension, atherosclerosis, obesity, diabetes, cancer, lung and kidney disease, and liver cirrhosis. The same occurred elsewhere. Swiss pathologist Professor Alex Tzankov reported that many victims had suffered from hypertension. Most were overweight, 2/3 had heart problems, and 1/3 had diabetes. The Italian Minister of Health reported that 96% of COVID-19 hospital deaths had been patients with at least one severe underlying illness. Almost 50% had 3 or more pre-existing conditions. Interestingly, Puschel found lung embolism in every 3rd patient. Pulmonary embolism usually arises through detachment of blood clots in deep veins of the legs that are swept into the lungs. Clots typically form from blood flow sags in the legs, as were the elderly spend the day seated and inactive, A high frequency of lung embolism was already described in deceased influenza patients 50 years ago. Thus, we are not on the verge of discovering a unique property of SARS-CoV-2 that would heighten its threat, but we do bear witness to the observed situation where the elderly seek to protect themselves by obeying the chant that sounds around the world, "Stay at home." Physical inactivity is pre-programmed, thrombosis included. Swedish epidemiologist Professor Jan Gisk recommended exactly the opposite. As much fresh air and activity as possible. The man knows his job. The number of genuine COVID-19 fatalities remained unknown outside Hamburg. The situation was no better in other countries. Walter Riccardo, advisor to the Italian Ministry of Health, stated in a March review with the Telegraph that 88% of the Italian coronavirus deaths had not been due to the virus. The problem with coronavirus death counts is such that the number can be viewed as nothing other than a gross overestimation. In Belgium, not only fatalities with a positive COVID-19 test entered the ranks, but also those where COVID-19 was simply suspected. Also those where COVID-19 were simply suspected. Scientific competence did not seem to rule the agenda of Germany's RKI. Fortunately, there are scientists who stand out in contrast. Stanford professor John Ioannidis is one of the eminent epidemiologists of our times. When it became clear that the epidemic in Europe was nearing its end, he showed how the officially reported numbers of the coronavirus deaths could be used to calculate the absolute risk of dying from COVID-19. The risk for a person under 65 years in Germany was about as high as a daily drive of 24 kilometres. The risk was low even for the elderly, 80 with coronavirus deaths per 100,000. So I'm just going to read this again. So the risk was low even for the elderly, 80 with 10 coronavirus deaths per 100,000, 80 years old in Germany. Calculation of this number is simple. About 8.5 million citizens are 80 years in Germany. About 8,500 coronavirus deaths were recorded in this age group. This leads to an absolute risk of coronavirus death of 10 per 10,000 80-year-olds. Now realise that every year about 1,200 of 10,000 80-year-olds die in Germany. Blank column data from the Federal Office of Statistics. So there's a little graph there. I'll let you see that. Don't know if you can see that. Nearly half of them due to cardiovascular disease, CVD, almost a third from cancer, and around 10% over 100 owing to respiratory infection. The latter have always been caused by a multitude of pathogens, including the coronavirus family. It is obvious that a new member has now joined the club and that SARS-CoV-2 cannot be assigned any special role as a killer virus. This is underlined by another observation. Severe respiratory infections are registered by the RKI in the context of influenza surveillance. The vertical line marks the time when documentation of SARS-CoV-2 infection was started. Was there ever any indication for an increase in the number of respiratory infections? No. The 2019-20 winter peak is followed by typical seasonal decline, and note that the lockdown red arrows was implemented when the curve had almost reached baseline. So I'll just show you that graph. Okay. So how does the new coronavirus compare with influenza virus? The WHO warned the world that the COVID-19 virus was much more infectious than the illness could take a very serious course, and that no vaccination or medication was available. The WHO abstained from explaining that truly effective medication hardly exists against any viral disease, and that vaccination against seasonal flu is increasingly recommended as being ineffective or even counterproductive. Furthermore, the WHO disregarded 2 points that needed to first be addressed before any valid comparison of the virus could be undertaken. How many people died of COVID-19 compared with influenza? The WHO claimed that 3 to 4% of COVID-19 patients would die, which by far exceeded the fatality rate of annual influenza. This is important enough to call for a closer look. Influenza viruses pass wave-like through the population. The waves can be small in one year and high in another. Case fatality rates are 0.1% to 0.2% during a normal flu season in Germany, which translates to several hundreds of deaths. In contrast, there were approximately 35,000 influenza-related deaths in the 1995 to 1996 season, and approximately 15,000 deaths in 2002 to 2003, 2004 to 2005. The RKI estimated that the last great flu epidemic of 2017-2018 claimed 25,000 lives. With 330,000 reported cases, the fatality rate would be 8%. As in all previous years, Germany weathered this epidemic without implementing any unusual measures. The WHO estimates that there are 290,000 to 650,000 flu deaths each year. Now turn to COVID-19 in May. The RKI calculated that 170,000 infections and 7,000 coronavirus deaths equal a 4% case fatality rate, as predicted by the WHO. Conclusion: COVID-19 is really 10 times more dangerous